Up to the 15th century, a major genre of Japanese literature was the Monogatari, and the Ise Monogatari, whose composition began in the 9th century, is one of the most ancient works of Japanese literature, along with the Taketori Monogatari. The Taketori Monogatari, though a personal favorite, is a prose composition, but the Ise Monogatari is a longer, rather more opaque work in a subgenre that combines prose and poetry. Some 1700 years later, faraway English poets would develop the dreaded sonnet, but the Nara and Heian period literati had the tanka, an unrhyming form whose rigid structure depends on syllables per verse, something like its descendant, the haiku. A normal tanka is 5 lines, 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5, 7, 7. There have been many versions of the Ise Monogatari over the centuries. The one I've got is Joshua S. Mostow and Royall Tyler's English translation, The Ise Stories. Before I make any mistakes, please remember that I'm no expert on Japanese language, literature, or history. Basically, just ignore this video. As you can see, navy blue cloth covers wrap the Ise Stories. If the book cover on a Libris is any indication, there might have been an attractive dust jacket at some point, but this copy's had already vanished when I bought it 5 or 6 years ago. The translators, Joshua S. Mostow and Royall Tyler, are notable experts on Japanese literature. Mostow has written a number of books about pre-modern Japanese literature, specimens of those extremely expensive academic books few will ever read. Tyler earned fame for his English translation of the Genji Monogatari, which I read many years ago. I have it here. Wait, this is a Sight and Sticker translation. Ah, there's Tyler's translation. I'm running out of room on these shelves. The Ise Stories opens with the usual acknowledgments. There follows an informative introduction providing a history of the text and its interpretations. Then comes the translation proper. Adorning many episodes of the translation are these charming illustrations lifted from the Ise Monogatari's 1608 printing. I love the cartoon-like quality of traditional Japanese art. Apparently, these illustrations were quite influential among Edo period painters. I wish every book was illustrated. Words can stand on their own, yeah, but what story doesn't stand to benefit from attractive pictures? Anyway, each episode also includes the translator's summary of past commentators' different interpretations of the text. The Ise Stories concludes with some appendices of the dozens of characters potentially involved, so boring academic stuff, but important if you're serious about understanding this book. By Mostow and Tyler's own admission, the Ise Monogatari's standard English translation is Helen McCullough's Tales of Ise, published in 1968. I don't have that one. Why did Mostow and Tyler opt for the Ise Stories instead? Quote, "The oldest section of the Ise includes the hero's secret meeting with the Ise priestess. That is, the priestess of the major shrine to the sun goddess Amaterasu at Ise. Ise Monogatari, our translators go on to explain, does not mean tales of Ise, but rather a collection of tales, including that one about the Ise priestess. Therefore, they claim, Ise Stories is more accurate. Traditionally, the Ise Monogatari was ascribed to Ariwara no Narihira, a 9th century nobleman who was demoted to commoner status for his relative's failed coup against the Saga Emperor. Ariwara no Narihira was a well-regarded poet. Several of his waka appear in an early Japanese poetry anthology, the Kokinshu. He was also quite the libertine, his legendary exploits comparable to Casanova's, except that Casanova was a pedophile and rapist who claimed to have impregnated his own daughter, so maybe I shouldn't have made that reference. Over the centuries, Narihira's sexual adventures probably got exaggerated. After his death, so the legend goes, his last wife, the poet Ise no Go, compiled his largely biographical writings into the 125 episodes of the Ise Monogatari. If true, that'd provide a different explanation for the title, except that when Narihira died, Ise no Go was a toddler, so that version of events doesn't check out. Today, scholars widely accept a different narrative. It's like this. Narihira himself wrote some of the poems, and after his death in 880, other writers expanded the text to assorted political and aesthetic ends. Then in 1234, Fujiwara no Teika, himself an influential writer, had a version of the text transcribed for his granddaughter. This version, called the Tempuku Bon, is accepted as the definitive Ise Monogatari. Why? Mostow and Tyler don't really say. The history of textual interpretations is about as convoluted. Commentators have taken the Ise Monogatari for everything from Narihira's artistic autobiography to a series of guarded statements about contemporary politics to an esoteric book of tantric sex with Narihira as an earthly avatar of the Bodhisattva canon. A commentary called the Waka Chicken Shu, the introduction informs us, insists that Narihira brought enlightenment through sexual intercourse to 3,733 women! Damn, was this guy a swinger! I mention this tantric interpretation since it strikes me as hilariously insane, but who knows? Maybe Narihira as a Buddhist sex divinity made sense 800 years ago. The problem with esoteric commentaries such as Ise Monogatari Zunyo is that they follow none of these guidelines for proper interpretation. As we have seen, they are irrational or Gnostic. When the commentaries perform philological analyses of obscure words and phrases, they do so by means of an allegorical etymologizing that is no longer accepted as an interpretive mode. They show almost no interest in pragmatic issues except to describe certain secret rituals performed for court ceremonials involving poetry or in aesthetics. In other words, the Kamakura commentaries instantiate religious and literary modes of interpretation completely different from our own and are therefore difficult to assimilate into our contemporary critical practices. The tale of Genji's author, Murasaki Shikibu, apparently found inspiration for her flirtatious Genji in the fictionalized Narihira. Although, like Casanova, Genji's also a pedophiliac creep. What the hell, Murasaki? The Ise Stories' 125 chapters are mostly episodic. Adding to the confusion, in accordance with a cultural practice of the Heian nobility, many episodes don't identify the characters by name. The names that do appear, though, belong to real-life historical figures. Most of the Ise Monogatari's episodes open with the famous Mukashi Otoko Arikeri. The Ise Stories renders the line, "Back then there was this man." This man is generally understood to be Ariwara no Narihira, and following in that great tradition of assuming, I'll assume so too. To me, the Ise Stories is a chain of amorous anecdotes about a fictional version of Ariwara no Narihira and other contemporary historical figures. Nobles write poems to each other, two lovers tragically can't be together, a couple breaks up but keeps in touch, occasionally a man loves another man, and so on. Yeah, a man named Ki no Aritsune, lonely after his wife became a Buddhist nun, recurs in a few episodes as another of Narihira's lovers. Well, maybe. This point, like everything else in the book, is cryptic. Some academics interpret this as more of a romantic friendship, though. From Sogi's day until our own, the Ise has seemed to invite readers to interpret its portraits of male friendship in terms of familiar sexual epistemologies, and yet, as we shall see, the portrait simultaneously resists such interpretation and require the reader to become sensitive to alternative intelligibilities of male-male bonding. The fact is, male love, same-sex love, and homosexuality as defined by later discourses are conspicuously absent from the Ise. What we find instead is male friendship. Not to downplay the diversity of human relationships, but this could be a case of heteronormative commentators glossing over the obvious meaning. Don't misunderstand the complexity of the Ise Stories, though. The tale of Genji is a painfully intricate psychological novel. The Ise Stories, not so much. Most of its episodes don't fill half a page, only a few sentences to nestle context around the tanka. Episode 6. Back then there was this man. Year after year he courted a lady he was unlikely ever to win. Poor guy. Until at last, he managed to abduct her under cover of darkness. Oh no. The previous 4 stories feature Narihira pining after Fujiwara no Takaiko, a future imperial consort, so I'll assume this is the finale of this little story arc. The 5th episode seems to imply that Takaiko returns Narihira's feelings, but that her family doesn't want him around. In the commentary to a later story, Mostow and Tyler say, "Bride stealing was not uncommon during some periods of Japanese history, and was often more in the nature of an elopement." So let's hope what's happening here is more eloping and less kidnapping. The path he took led them to a watercourse called Akuta River, where she saw dewdrops on the grass and asked him what they were. This sentence exemplifies the kind of interpretive difficulty with this book. Besides debate on what the Akuta River might be, the commentary on this story asks, what kind of person doesn't recognize dew? When I read it, I assumed the dew thing shows just how cloistered Takaiko is. The commentator Katagiri took it the same way, but really, that's an unconvincing read. Even the most sheltered person's gonna recognize dew. I prefer Reise Tamekazu's take. The metaphorical dew is semen dripping from her vagina after she and Narihira have sex. Ah, we're already talking about cum. This must be a good book. Next, as the lightning begins to flash through the night, Narihira and Takaiko take shelter in an abandoned storehouse. Narihira stands watch with his bow and arrow, but doesn't realize that the true danger already lurks inside the building. Over the thunder, he doesn't hear Takaiko scream when the resident demon swallows her. In the morning, Narihira assumes she snuck away, and irritated, composes the story's only poem. I'm not gonna read it aloud. Commentators assume the preceding story was invented to explain these confusing verses. Ending the story is yet another emendation. It says that Takaiko was staying with her cousin and glosses the demon as Takaiko's brother sneaking in to bring her back to the house. I assume some writer, assuming the book to be a historical document about Narihira and Takaiko, appended this because the real Fujiwara no Takaiko was not eaten by a demon, believe it or not. This adds a psychological dimension to the story, right? Initially, the reader thinks the brothers are a demon, suggesting that Narihira, in the dark depths of the stormy night, imagines a demon swallowing Takaiko. It puts us in his mental space. The addition of the brothers also acts like a twist ending. Instead of supernatural sadness, we have a caper. See what I mean about these stories? They're short but sophisticated, and you feel like you're missing something, though you're not quite sure what. Whether this stems from intention or from multiple authors editing the story over multiple generations, the effect is compelling. The woodblock illustration helps the tale stick in my memory too. That must be the Akuta River. In a section devoted to the education of women, Soko argued that while the values to be imparted to young women were the same as those directed at young men, the objective of instruction was different, namely to train women to be subservient wives. He went on as follows, quote, "It is common in our country to give girls still being brought up in the recesses of the home, Genji Monogatari, Ise Monogatari, and such like books, and to employ a woman teacher and have her explain the text to them. Girls then devote themselves to poetry composition, do painting and calligraphy, make artificial flowers, play the koto, and hold merry feasts. This is because people have lost understanding of the instruction of girls. In my opinion, books like Genji Monogatari and Ise Monogatari pursue the emotional relationships of the sexes and principally concern the sensual. Consequently, ethics are forgotten and the sensual relationships between lord and retainer, father and son, husband and wife, fall into disarray." As James McMullen points out, in his youth, Yamaga Soko had evidently tried his hand at writing a commentary on Genji, but this was not simply a youthful indiscretion, for even in 1675 his personal library contained copies of Genji Monogatari, Ise Monogatari, and several commentaries on Genji. This was not a man then who utterly repudiated these texts, but rather one who thought them unsuitable reading matter for women. In this, he shared much the same views that we have already seen to enjoy some currency among contemporary sinologists. Episode 9. This is the longest story, featuring 4 tanka and 4 illustrations. It's the 3rd episode of a narrative arc called the Azuma Kudari, or Journey to the East. In the customary understanding of these stories, Takaiko, having become an imperial consort, has fallen totally out of Narihira's reach. He decides to leave his bad memories in Heiankyo behind and heads east for Azuma. But like everything else, there's dispute over how to understand the Azuma Kudari. The 20th century academic Katagiri Yoichi notes that although all the pre-modern scholars understood this episode in the context of the previous episodes and believed that the man leaves the capital because of a love affair, the language at the start of the story refers to the man feeling frustration at his lack of advancement at court. According to the Reizei school of interpretation, Narihira never went east at all, and the whole Azuma Kudari is an allegory for Narihira taking refuge in Regent Yoshifusa's estate. You start realizing after a while that maybe nobody at any point had any clue what they were talking about when it came to anything ever. Unlike Story 6, Story 9 doesn't have much action. Instead, like the vast majority of the Ise stories, a bunch of elegant, courtly people are elegant at each other. Narihira and 1 or 2 old friends leave Heiankyo, but don't know their way around. Instead of embarking on an orderly journey east, they meander around the countryside, visiting different scenic spots. They stop at a place called Yatsuhashi, where the river fanned out there spider-wise into 8 streams. Spider-wise. Weird word. Seems it was invented for this translation. The original text uses the phrase kumode, which means the rivers fan out like a spider's legs. I feel like the translation could have been clearer and more elegant. Anyway, Narihira and his friends sit near the rivers with bowls of rice, observing the blooming irises. One of the friends asks Narihira to compose a poem like an acrostic, where the first kana of each line collectively spell Kakitsubata, Japanese for irises. As if my man Narihira would turn down a poem challenge. In the interests of preserving each tanka's original sound, Rostow and Tyler include a romanized version of the original alongside the English translation. I've seen this before. Earlier I mentioned Helen McCullough. I have here an ugly reprinting of her 1985 translation of the Kokin Wakashū, a 9th century imperial Japanese poetry anthology. When I asked for McCullough's Kokin Wakashū, I received it as a gift, I was under the impression that it was a bilingual edition, English and Japanese. It is, strictly speaking, but I was annoyed to flip the pages open and just see dang Romaji. I thought it was absurd then, and I think it is now in the Ise Stories. Why not include the kana too, alongside the Romaji in English? Get to the iris acrostic already! Okay, here's the translation. Robe from far Cathay, long and comfortably worn, bound by love to stay, I cover these distances, shrouded in melancholy. Then they wept onto their parched rice till it got all wet. They cried over that? But this seems to be meant as comedy given the goofy detail about the rice. According to Mostow and Tyler, this iris acrostic is a tour de force. I believe them. Well, poetry might not translate well, but these illustrations are universal, full of mist and curves of sensuous nature. This one depicts Narihira and his friends sitting with their dry rice at Yatsuhashi. Check out that distinctive zigzag bridge behind them. According to Mostow and Tyler, the bridges were originally understood as 8 bridges over 8 rivers whose flow intersected at the same spot, but after the Heian period, the meaning was lost, and artists began to portray the Yatsuhashi bridges as a single zigzag bridge, which in turn has become an icon of the Ise as a whole. A misinterpretation became iconic of the whole book? Seems fitting somehow. Next, Narihira and friends meet an ascetic, see Mount Fuji, and take a ferry across the Sumida River. Of course, each situation warrants another poem. While they ride his boat, the ferryman identifies an animal as a capital bird. The text was clearly written for an audience not familiar with Mount Fuji because it makes a big deal out of its height and snowy summit, comparing the snow to a heap of salt. Amusingly, the commentary indicates the term used for that analogy in the Japanese is shihojiri, salt buttocks. Over the centuries, commentators have apparently found this crude phrase troubling. I'd guess it was a regional term since they might be processing sea salt in coastal regions. Also, comparing a salt heap to a butt is funny. A lot of the Ise stories are. Anyway, in the next few stories, after sleeping around with some provincial women and some nasty classist humor about these out-of-touch hicks, the stories seemingly dump Narihira back in Heiankyo. Episode 49. We have here an episode in which this man is presumably back in the capital. This is a weird one. Over a paper fan, Narihira here is contemplating his extremely attractive younger sister, and recites a poem to her that means, I hate to think we won't have sex. Her reply poem is essentially, I'm confused about how to take this. Both metaphorically represent the sister as grass. Along with episode 6, this one remained clearest in memory after I read the Ise stories. Most of the others blurred, as though lost in the fog abundant in the illustrations. So if you want to grab people's attention, it's hard to go wrong with demons and incest. Mostow and Tyler say that commentators vigorously debated whether the woman is Narihira's full sister or half-sister, because of course they did, and also how to understand their response. The translation captures the apparent ambiguity of the sister's reaction. What surprises me is that early Japanese literature apparently has similar incestual scenes, including the tale of Genji in the chapter Agemaki, or Trefoil Knots, in which a nobleman uses an illustration of this scene to flirt with his sister. Seems Murasaki took the sister's reply to be pro-incest then. Scholarly consensus today, however, is that the sister now regrets the blind trust she put in her brother in the past. The Heian period was relatively open to all kinds of sex, but sex between blood siblings was probably as taboo then as today, which may explain why it interested writers. Episode 69. No, I didn't choose episode 69 for whatever reason you're thinking. I chose episode 69 because this is the actual Ise story. Narihira travels to Ise as the Imperial Huntsman, and the Ise priestess's mother tells her daughter to entertain him better than the usual envoy, and on his first day in Ise, she does. Mostow and Tyler's notes indicate that the real-life priestess, Narihira's father-in-law's sister, was named Tenchi. On the second day, Narihira asks Tenchi to sleep with him. This leads to a wistful midnight tryst. She waits until the rest of the household is asleep to sneak to Narihira, along with a servant girl for some reason. I suppose the taboo thrill of a sacred virgin having sex was an appealing fantasy to readers. But rather than get sexy, the situation stays sad and dreamy. He led her joyfully to his bed, and there she remained from midnight until nearly 3. Then she left before they'd said a single word to each other. He was too devastated to go back to bed at all. I appreciate that Tenchi's poem asks, "Did I dream it? Was it real?" So I'm not the only one picking up on a dreamy, surreal vibe. The cloudy illustrations contribute to that. Maybe this is Silent Hill. On the third day, Narihira ends up stuck at a drinking party, but in a poem says he might return. Our lover boy also weeps tears of blood. Tears of blood come up in medieval literature from all over the place. I seem to recall tons of hemolacria in The Knight in the Panther's Skin, for example, a classic from 12th century Georgia. Yeah, you might want to see a doctor about that. The commentators, of course, have to know whether Tenchi or Narihira actually did the deed. 69ing would only be appropriate given the context. Interpretations fall into 3 camps. A. Don't be ridiculous. Of course they had sex. I was about to read off the other 2 camps, but good old Katagiri is clearly correct. So let's carry on. Contrast between the 2 main actants was made at the outset, as the messengers Afamu let us meet was met with the princess's double negative, Bona mo fata ito afazito omo furazu, and she was certainly not thinking that they should not meet, which it seems to me means that something, although perhaps not exactly meeting, had crossed her mind. Appropriate to the cosmological homology that cast her as the pole star, the princess was characterized by the minimal action of nu, ne, sleeping together, mainly in the shape of puns, ne no toki and the negative suffix, starting with nemu, let us sleep together, paranomastically included in nemu goro in the above quotation, which then read retrospectively as her proposal to the man. In the description of their encounter, the difference between afamu and nemu was glossed over by the use of ari, being. Nonetheless, nu dominated afu, however we interpret these terms, in the sense that in the end there was an absence of reciprocity. Cf. that katarafanu, not telling each other, incorporated the negative afamu not meeting where the negative suffix was homophonous with where the incorporated the negative afanu not meaning where the negative suffix was homophonous with nu to sleep. The poetic exchange that followed was perhaps for that reason. What is this talking about? Episode 77. The later episodes of the Ise stories tend towards the smaller, but even so, I feel like there emerges a tone of reminiscence absent from the earlier stories. At Takaiko's funeral, the Right Chief Equerry, apparently Narihira, composes a silly poem. That is the event of this story. The narration is critical. To a modern eye, this is just no good. It touched everyone at the time, though. Perhaps it was simply the best anyone there could do. There are other stories that feature this kind of criticism, too. With comments like this, you can imagine Narihira as an old man reflecting on his life, loves, and work. From an era when autobiography was extremely rare, it's humanizing, even touching. And weird, since these details don't come from the real-life Narihira's brush, but from later editors. But even if there is a core story, as Bowring has termed it, the original Ise does not present a clear and logical narrative from one episode to the next, since it is, after all, the poems that are the presumed center of attention, rather than the prose that merely provides context for the poetry. This leaves free play for the imagination, and that is surely what Harunobu himself has done here. He has provided an assortment of poem-like visual vignettes in the couple, in foreground grasses in the river beyond, and in the distant scene of foxes by the shrine. The single textual element of the character Kasa links the print to the actual personage of Kasamori Osen, but it is scarcely enough to produce a clear story. Rather, it would seem to have been intended by the use of multiple metate as a multi-layered set of various possible narratives, much like the Ise Monogatari itself. In episode 125, Narihira dies. So ends the Ise stories. I guess it's part of that Japanese mono no aware aesthetic, where the transience of people and things lends them a beauty. The Ise stories give me a taste of a foundational literary work, and as a bonus, it's pretty weird. The lovely illustrations and extensive commentary really propel the Ise stories over the top into a sterling piece of work. That's just Joshua S. Mostow and Royall Tyler's The Ise Stories, though. You can't really review a book like the Ise Monogatari, not because it's beyond reproach, but because whether a modern reader considers it good is a moot point. Now I'll address the elephant in the room. I really appreciate the translator's decision to keep the translated poems in tanka form, but this is the Ise Stories' Achilles heel. Can these poems as English poems really measure up to the originals? For me, reading the Ise stories is like being invested in every aspect of a musical except the actual songs. By including the romaji, Mostow and Tyler imply the English poems lack something. The only point the romaji serve is to let the reader mouth the sound of the original, although to someone who doesn't speak Japanese, it is only sound and no meaning. The translated poems are fine, some are quite pretty, but for literature concerned more with form than information, translation can only emulate so much. You lose the wordplay for sure. Old Japanese poetry is full of puns. How about a second opinion? Several of the tanka from the Ise Monogatari appear in the Kokin. Here's Tenshi's poem from episode 69 as Mostow and Tyler render it. Did you come to me? Was it I who went to you? I have no idea. Did I dream it? Was it real? Was I sleeping or awake? In the Kokin, this poem, number 645, is attributed to Narihira no Ason, who I think is the same person as Narihira. Here's McCullough's translation. Might you have come here, or did I perhaps go there? I cannot recall. Was it dream or reality? Was I sleeping or waking? Very similar. I trust our translators at least accurately got the literal meaning across the language ocean. I prefer Mostow and Tyler's on this one, though the difference in meaning between I have no idea and I cannot recall seizes the imagination. Let's think for a second about canonical English sonnets from the likes of Edmund Spenser or Philip Sidney. For my tastes and interests, that stuff is boring, bland as unflavored porridge. So, to a contemporary Japanese reader not invested in medieval scholarship, maybe these medieval tanka feel boring too, or at least strange? Maybe they felt strange for a long time, if for centuries Japanese scholars couldn't decide what half the poems are getting at. Or maybe that's the point of the book. Maybe that's its strength. Anyway, I didn't pick Mostow and Tyler's The Ise Stories expecting great poetry, though a surprising elegance suffuses it, but out of historical and cultural interest. And that's the spirit in which I admire the book. Better to have a translation to receive some taste of the original than to leave 100% of it locked away in one language only.
Ihai.